Det var jo de årene da en hadde nok så sterke indre brytninger. Indre brytninger.
Hei og velkommen til Noen har snakket sammen. Mitt navn Tiril Rustan Halvorsen.
Og jeg heter Aksel Fjelldavli.
I dag får vi 2 gjester i studio. Først forfatteren av en nylig utgitt bok på Respublika, innleid og underbetalt, undercover i et arbeidsliv uten rettigheter, heter den. Forfatteren heter James Bloodworth, og han kommet hele veien fra Storbritannia for å lansere boka si.
Ja. Og usual disclaimer der jo Respublika jo forlaget som vi har i Agenda-familien.
Det stemmer. Og så kommer Hilde Nagell på besøk på nytt, får vi si, vår kollega, hun har også lest boka og skal si litt om hva man kan gjøre for å motvirke en sånn innleid og underbetalt arbeidsliv.
Spesielt i liksom
plattformøkonomien og samvirker. Hun har skrevet et notat på hvordan man kan bruke samvirker på å løse ulike samfunnsproblemer. Nå det plattformøkonomien hun kommer for å snakke om her.
Now we have James Bloodworth with us in the studio. He has just released his book in Norwegian this week. It's called Innleid og underbetalt. Where he is describing sort of the working class life in Britain, both in the workplace in 4 different companies, but also in the life in 4 different geographical locations in Britain. And my first question to you is, what was your main motivation for writing this book?
I'd say there was 3 main things, really. So the first would be that some of my favourite authors growing up had done similar types of projects. So George Orwell would be the most famous example. A writer called Jack London, an American author who did a similar kind of style of book over 100 years ago now. And more recently, Barbara Ehrenreich in the United States did a similar book. And so I was very kind of attached to that style of reporting, that kind of first-person narrative reporting. The other reason would be, one of the other reasons would be I grew up in a working class kind of family. I didn't go to university until I was 23, and I'd done many of the jobs that appear in my book a decade before I went back to research them for the book. So it was a case of going back and writing about things I'd seen when I was younger, but now going back as a journalist and having the skills, the kind of the ability to write about them in a way that I hadn't before. And then the third reason is probably because back when I set out to write the book in early 2016, there was a lot in Great Britain in the news about how the economy was well on the road to recovery after a long recession. There were a record number of people in work, etc. But if you looked behind the headlines, there was a much more disconcerting picture. For example, there was a big rise in precarious work, things like what we call 0-hour contracts in Britain, where you have no guaranteed number of hours each week. There was a big increase in people working in what's called the gig economy. So for companies like Uber, Deliveroo, delivery companies in particular, where people are not employed as such. They're classed as self-employed contractors, so they lack the workers' rights that many people in the past had. So behind the scenes, there was this big transformation in the economy going on, and I wanted to really investigate that in a bit more depth, which I felt I could do that better in this style of book, where I could go out there, spend 6 months just focusing on this issue, and put my other journalism projects to one side and just really immerse myself in this.
You mentioned writers like Jack London and George Orwell. I suppose back in their days, the working class life would be a bit different than what you see. You know, the stereotype of the working class man working in a mine or working in a factory. But what you describe is not exactly the same as their lives, or what's the differences?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's very different in many ways, in that I mean, especially Jack London was doing this in, I think, 1903. So this is, there's a world of difference between the East End of London in 1903 and 2016. But there are also some things which are similar, which is there are some similarities, which is, I would say, and with George Orwell's work as well as like slightly more recently, in that you still have a class of people who, a section of the working class which is typically ignored by mainstream society, a section of the working class which very often is predominantly migrant labour, so is metaphorically voiceless, but also literally voiceless in terms of figuratively voiceless, but also literally voiceless in terms of many of them don't even speak the language. So many of the grievances these people have, you don't actually. You don't often hear about them in mainstream news. You don't often hear about them, their living conditions in mainstream kind of newspapers and television shows. So I suppose without wishing to compare myself to those kinds of writers, that would sound like very conceited. But I took it as an inspiration that what those writers had done, in that I wanted to also give those people a voice as well and go out and live side by side with them, and then allow them to articulate in the interviews I did with those people their grievances, but also to articulate to a middle class audience the kind of the sights, the sounds, the smells of that, and the kind of the things you go through in that world that they may not have considered before.
Because you basically applied for jobs and took the ones you got. So you were working in Amazon at the warehouse as a Uber chauffeur, and at a call center, and also in a nursery home or something.
Nursing home. Not nursing home. It was. I wasn't in an actual home, but I was doing care visits to people in their own homes. Yes.
But what you actually are describing in your book is whole communities and societies that these people who work in these companies live in, and they are also changing in a way because of this kind of precarious work.
Yeah, so the book started off as just being a book about work. So it started off as being a book about I'd go in the original idea I envisaged was I would go into these different low pay workplaces, write about the experience in terms of what it was like to live on that wage, what it was like in terms of working for this company, etc. But as the book developed, I realised I had to put these jobs into a context, and that was first of all a local context, and then a national context in terms of socio-economic changes over the past few years, which have resulted in these companies being in these places and these situations being as they were. So what I did was, when I worked, say, for Amazon, I would work in the Amazon warehouse, but then in my spare time, I would be living in this community amongst local people and amongst other people who worked at Amazon. So it also became important to tell the story of the local community, because you have to put this stuff in a context. So you have this Amazon warehouse in a town, but then I also wanted to know then what people in the local community felt about the working conditions at the Amazon warehouse, whether they worked there themselves, whether they had friends and family who worked there, what existed before the Amazon warehouse, what it had replaced. And I'm really glad I did do this, because I set out to write the book early 2016, but then throughout 2016, there were a series of political backlashes in Britain through the Brexit vote, in the United States through the rise of Donald Trump. And some of this is attributable to the resentment felt in these kind of working class communities, that what's happened to their communities over recent decades, the replacement of old industrial jobs where you know, not necessarily the most pleasant jobs, but where you had institutions like trade unions, where you had stability, where you could have a job for life. The replacement of these jobs with a much more precarious and insecure style of work, which is often poorly paid, but where also it's very hard to kind of support a family. It's very hard to maintain a stable mode of living, if you like, and that creates a great deal of insecurity and alienation and resentment, and we've seen the political backlash from that. So it was important to put these jobs in a context.
Can you, just to make it more like graphical to us, you know, most people in Norway would have ordered a book or something from Amazon at one point, and can you tell us what is sort of happening behind the scenes from when you push the button until you get the book? Like, how is it to to work in the warehouse?
Well, I mean, I was I wouldn't be able to tell the story of the entire process because I was in the distribution side. So I was in a distribution warehouse, or as Amazon called it, fulfillment center. We weren't allowed to call it a warehouse.
Sounds very like a Brave New World.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, there was also other things. So you weren't fired or you weren't sacked. You were released. That was another one. But it was, so we were at the distribution, we were in a distribution center basically. And so it was the final leg before items would go out, be sent out to the postal services where they'd be delivered, for example. So what we would be doing is we'd go into work and we'd have this algorithmic, handheld device, which would, you'd clock in essentially and it would send you around the warehouse, a timer would start counting down when you scanned an item and it would give you coordinates for where the next item was in the warehouse and the timer would start counting down. Then when you scan that, it would start, the timer would, like an egg timer kind of thing, would start counting down again. And you'd have to make it to the next item before the timer ran out. And if you didn't, and all of this would be...
It's like a game.
And all of the data from that would feed into a central computer and then several human beings would come around with clipboards with all the data in and tell you where you were in the ranking. So it's a bit like Black Mirror, if you've ever seen that. There's an episode that's a bit like that. And so I was told the first week that I was in the bottom 10% of productivity, and I was quite shocked by that because I thought I was doing pretty well.
It's hard to get that on paper.
Yeah, and what's interesting is you don't know whether that's true or not. So they could have just been saying that to everyone to speed you up. I have no way of knowing whether that's true. I'm still kind of skeptical whether it was because I thought I was pretty. Good. There was definitely people slower than me. Yeah. But yeah, so that's what you were doing, and you were picking the items, putting them up in these yellow baskets, and then you put them on a conveyor belt, and they go down to this area where robots take them out. And then I don't know what happens after that. They go out for delivery, I think.
It strikes me from sort of a analytical point of view what you are describing at Amazon, but also in the other workplaces is what the sociologist John Goldthorpe describes as sort of the characteristics of the working class job, because you have a lack of freedom, you have a lot of control mechanisms, you have surveillance, and you are just put in a position where you just are asked to do specific tasks, and then you go back to your boss and then get new tasks. And now the boss is the algorithm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the boss is kind of the algorithm, but at the same time, there are human beings that program things into the algorithm. So all the algorithm is doing is learning from pre-programmed instructions, which are set down by someone at Amazon at some point. It's certainly true in that the job completely lacks any kind of autonomy. So you're simply directed around. You effectively have to ask to use the toilet as well, because if you had to, in this warehouse, it was the size of 10 football pitches. It was, as they would boast all the time, it was like four floors high, and I was working on the fourth floor, and there were only 2 toilets, and they're on the bottom floor, and you have to go through airport-style security to reach them each time. And you're being given disciplinaries if you take too long going to the toilet and stuff, so you're having to ask even for this. You're being kind of having to empty your wallet every time you go to the bathroom and things like this. So it's not just you lack autonomy, but it's also slightly like on a kind of low level. There's a low level of humiliation throughout the kind of work day where you feel like you're under a kind of cloud of suspicion, even when you're not doing anything wrong, which is a peculiar climate, really, to work in. It's a peculiar way to have to live and work.
And it's a horrible conditions to work under. But also what I started to think about when I read, especially about your stay at the Amazon, when you don't get written contracts and the places you lived and all the surveillance. Actually, how legal is this?
Yeah, no, it's so at Amazon we weren't. I suppose some people were given contracts, but I wasn't given a contract when I started. And so I asked I wanted a contract because I'm writing about it undercover, so I want to actually see what it says in the contract. But they refused to give me a contract, the agency, and they said they lied about it and said that it was there was no contract because I was on a 0 hours contract, as if that meant there wouldn't be a paper contract. But that's not just flatly not true. But they didn't know I know this, so they tried to essentially fob me off, as the expression goes, fob me off and pretend that this wasn't a contract, wasn't something I would normally receive for that, which was untrue. So I never did receive a contract. So I wasn't aware of what my rights were in the workplace. Well, I was, because I was an undercover journalist, but the typical person wouldn't be aware of necessarily what their rights were in the workplace. And that's especially disconcerting when so many of the workers were not even from the UK in the first place. So it's especially important to communicate what their rights are in the country and in a workplace in the country. So that was the first kind of red flag, as it were, when I started, that maybe something is amiss here. Maybe this is not going to be the best place to work if they won't even give me a contract. I mean, what are they trying to hide?
Yeah, I'm just asking because even in Norway there's a debate going on about poor working conditions, and there's two things that's pure criminal conditions and more like they are taking advantage of the workers. And if something is not legally in Norway, we have authorities that can come in and shut the place down or whatever. Did you experience any of that, or how is the legality of what Amazon is doing?
I mean, yeah, to be honest, I didn't experience any kind of pushback against Amazon specifically on the part of the law, I guess, on the part of enforcement, law, like HMR, like Revenue and Customs is who enforces it in the UK, enforces these laws. I mean, there's been more noise from the British government in general about cracking down on malpractice in the workplace from employers. But when I was working at Amazon, it didn't feel like there was any kind of action that would be taken against some of these companies for what was going on. Funnily enough, but since the book's come out and since there's been just more broadly publicity against Amazon, now there's been more pressure put on the company. I mean, I did some work with Bernie Sanders back in the summer, last summer. We made some videos, and then he did a campaign. And so there are politicians in the United States and in Britain who've kind of started to take on the kind of corporate culture at Amazon, if you like, and that I feel that has had some impact on Amazon's behaviour, because then they increased their minimum wage in the UK and in the United States. Jeff Bezos has been on this kind of publicity PR campaign to improve his image, and this is a result of like a collective effort by us, me with the book, the trade unions, by politicians like Bernie Sanders, who've been constantly, by trade unions in Europe who've been campaigning against some of the things going on at Amazon. It's a result of a grassroots thing. It's not been led by politicians, and it's not been led by government, certainly, who've taken their eye off the ball. It's been led by grassroots campaigns who've then put pressure and shamed the company into actually treating their staff better.
Among those 4 companies you work for, 3 of them, in my view, sort of is they could have existed 30 years ago, 40 years ago. You could have had a large storehouse where workers were carrying things around, and you could have had like a company like CareWatch or a call center. But Uber sort of is the odd one out, and you describe sort of in the book starting to work there sort of as a you got this feeling of a freedom because you didn't have like a boss. Do you agree that Uber is like very different from these other 3 companies? Or
yes, I mean, there's a sense of, the only kind of real sense of freedom that you did have with Uber, although it was real, was you just didn't have to turn the phone app on if you didn't want to work. So you could, it's not like in a normal company, if your boss phones you like in the morning, you can't just not pick the phone up or you lose your job. At the same time, though, as soon as you did turn the phone app on, you were very tightly controlled and monitored by Uber. So flexibility was genuine flexibility, which Uber talks about a great deal in terms of encouraging people to work for the company, being your own boss, etc. It was in practice very limited. I mean, during our induction for Uber, because you have an induction before you go out on the road, we were told that you can't pick and choose what jobs you do. If Uber sends you a job, you have to do it. You were monitored a great deal in terms of the star ratings. And if your average your average rating fell below 4.7 stars, you would be invited into the office for basically a dressing down. And if you if it remained below 4.7 stars, there would be a temporary ban on you using the app, or a permanent ban potentially put in place. So you'd be fired, basically. And you were even told what you could talk about in the back with the passenger in the back of your car. So you weren't allowed to talk about politics, religion, or sport with your passenger. Which, as a cab driver, it's like they're the only things you typically can talk. You do talk about. So. Yeah, I mean, if that was in a standard kind of employee-employer relationship, that would be maybe unsurprising. But this was a situation where you were supposed to be self-employed, and you'd lost your right to a minimum wage, to holiday pay and sick pay, on the basis that you had freedom and autonomy, and you were your own boss and you were self-employed. Yet, in practice, you were treated just like an employee. And in practice, the person in the back of your car felt like they were Uber's customer, not your customer.
You already mentioned Brexit, but can you tell us a bit more about what your book can teach us about Brexit?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, Brexit hadn't happened when I set out to write the book. As I kind of spent longer and longer doing the research for the book, as I kind of got deeper into the 6 months, it became kind of obvious in some of the places I was visiting, not obvious, but understandable why some people had wanted to reject the status quo, if you like. So, and funnily enough, all of the areas I lived and worked in outside of London voted for Brexit, overwhelmingly for Brexit. And they would traditionally have been considered left-leaning, like Labour Party voting areas. Yet they voted for Brexit because there were obviously the traditional reasons that people voted for Brexit, that they just didn't like immigration or a general kind of reactionary anti-European sentiment. But there were also many people who felt that like their communities, understandably in many ways, had got worse over the past 30 or 40 years. Even jobs like in industries such as coal mining, which is a very dangerous and high-risk job where people die underground and things like this. People felt like, at least with those jobs, you had a stability, you had a job for life, you had a decent wage, you weren't going to be fired for going to the toilet because the trade union would go out on strike if something like that happened.
And also a different kind of pride than some of those jobs that you describe.
Yeah, so there was an identity attached to the work as well. So a former collier in Rugeley called Alex, he said to me that during the research for the book, he said to me that he'd see people around Rugeley, the town of Rugeley, and they would say, "I only work at Amazon." And he said, "I'd never say I'm only a collier, because that's what you were and you were proud of it." And that thing really stuck with me when he said that, because it's also about identity as well. Identity can be empowering or disempowering, and it's how identity is something how you relate to other people and how you see your place in the world. And jobs such as in the old like steelworks in South Wales, in some of the coal mines, in those kind of manufacturing jobs, the identity attached to them for a working class person could still be quite an empowering identity. It wasn't something with shame necessarily attached to it. Whereas if in the Amazon warehouse, it was something quite different. It didn't feel like you had an empowering identity. It felt like you were just being treated essentially like dirt. And it didn't feel like there was any kind of anything. You didn't have any autonomy. There was nothing empowering about that. This is a situation for many people that's very empowering. It's not just the material poverty of that job; it's the lack of dignity, the lack of self-respect that goes with that.
We are running out of time, so I guess I can say thank you for coming here and telling these stories from working class Britain.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, and I'll encourage everyone to read the book as well.
Ja, nå har vi snakket med James Bloodworth, som har skrevet denne boka om prekært arbeid og innleid og underbetalt, som boka heter, i Storbritannia. Og mye av det som virker som utfordringen eller problemet og årsaken til det har blitt sånn som det har blitt, er jo at det ikke er noe særlig motmakt til arbeidsgiverne og de store selskapene. Og for oss i Norge så er jo fagorganisering en veldig sånn åpenbart eksempel på hva man kan gjøre med det. Men Hilde Nagell, som vår kollega i Tankesmien Agenda, du har jo skrevet en del om samvirker, og du har tidligere også vært der og snakket om arbeidereide bedrifter. Men nå tenkte jeg at vi skulle høre litt med deg om plattformøkonomien og hvordan man kan drive samvirker der. For han har jo blant annet jobbet med Uber, James. Hva det du har tenkt når du har lest boka om Uber, for eksempel?
Ja, altså den arbeidsvirkeligheten som beskrives der, det jo ikke noe noen av oss ønsker seg, tror jeg. Det nærmest som definisjonen på en ufri arbeidssituasjon på alle måter. Nå det kanskje litt viktig å huske på at i Norge så plattformøkonomi gudskjelov et relativt sånn lite fenomen. Fafo har gjort en undersøkelse på det, sier at omkring 1% jobber i en type plattformer.
Så, og da tenker du ikke på delingsøkonomi, bare så at vi får rydda unna det?
Og det liksom viktig skille, ikke sant? Fordi man tenker på delingsøkonomi, så tenker man på alle de nye måtene som man har mulighet til å dele på nå med plattform, altså med en app da. Og det jo i stor grad et veldig positivt fenomen, og noe som det har blitt mer av, som vi også vil ønske mer velkommen. Men plattformøkonomi jo da at man gjennom plattformen tilbyr tjenester, som noen da på den andre siden betaler for, og at det et plattformselskap i midten som tar en rente for at denne utvekslingen foregår. Så det en markedsplass for også da arbeidskraft. Og det jo typisk Uber-eksempelet. Men det Fafo også finner i sin rapport, eller sier, at dette kan også smitte over på en måte på vanlige bedrifters måte å organisere arbeidet sitt på, ved at det blir mer sånn on demand, at det lettere å koble sammen arbeidskraft med en oppgave, som kan gi noe av de samme problemene også kanskje i sånn tradisjonelle bedrifter og virksomheter. Men jeg tror det den boka viser veldig tydelig at her har man så lite som du inne på motmakt. Og det spørsmålet hvordan kan man gjøre det? Den mest åpenbare svaret har jo alltid vært fagorganisere seg. Så fagbevegelsen tenker jeg har en veldig viktig oppgave her, å se til denne type arbeid og denne type, hva skal jeg si, det jo ikke engang ansettelsesforhold ofte, men denne type arbeidsfolk og hva de utsettes for, og kanskje ta en litt sånn tydeligere rolle der. Og det kan de gjøre på flere måter. Det kan man jo enten gjøre ved at de tilbyr medlemskap, og på den måten organiserer dem opp i de tradisjonelle fagforeningene. Fagbevegelsen støtter streiker, for eksempel, eller støtter aksjoner. Stiller sine ressurser tilgjengelig for en type organisering av disse interessene. Og det kan for eksempel være da at det finnes noe som heter Fair Work, som en app som gir en oversikt over og rater plattformselskapene ut fra hvordan de gjør det på en del områder, som hvordan arbeidsbetingelsene
Slå man tilbake med samme våpen da?
Ja, egentlig, ikke sant? Sånn at det å bruke plattformen positivt da, eller bruke den teknologien positivt. Men så var du inne på, Tiril, at det noe som det går jo an å tenke enda mer radikalt. Går an å tenke på at kanskje arbeidsfolk skal eie plattformen selv. For det jo noe veldig rart ved at det skal sitte noen eiere og ta en rente, og egentlig ikke delta i virksomheten heller, men tjene masse penger på plattformen. Det burde jo egentlig være de som utfører arbeidet, som også på en måte får fortjenesten av det. Og sånn som det nå, så det ikke, burde det ikke være, det ikke alt for store sånn startkostnader ved å kunne organisere seg selv da, på en sånn plattform. Og det har du sett en del eksempler på, spesielt innenfor taxinæringen. Det ikke så overraskende, for der har jo konkurransen fra Uber vært så massiv, og utfordringene så synlige. Så du har for eksempel noe som heter Green Taxi Initiative i Denver, som har blitt ganske stort, som et samvirke, rett og slett, av taxisjåfører, som var lei av å jobbe på den måten som den boka innleid og underbetalt skriver om.
Så da har de gått sammen, startet sin egen app, og som du sier, ikke nødvendigvis så kapitalkrevende å lage en app. Og så organiserer de seg selv og bestemmer over sin egen arbeidstid og arbeidslønn over gjennom den appen.
Ja, og her har de faktisk også fått støtte av fagforeningen til å komme i gang. Sånn at,
økonomisk støtte?
Ja, også, liksom, de har vært aktive, jeg kjenner ikke detaljene, men de har på en måte drevet lobbyvirksomhet for å få endret loven sånn at det skal være mulig, og de har også fungert som en sånn inkubator i oppstartsfasen, sånn at det skal være mulig å samles. For det klart, hvis du tenker på de arbeidsfolka som beskrives i den boka, så det ikke nødvendigvis at de har veldig mye ressurser eller overskudd når de kommer hjem etter en arbeidsdag til å gjøre noe som helst annet enn å tenke på neste arbeidsdag. Sånn at det at noen kan da, for eksempel da fagbevegelsen kan påta seg en sånn rolle til å tilrettelegge for at de kan ta ansvar for sin egen jobb på den måten at de har en egen plattform, det tenker jeg det er en spennende mulighet å se på fremover. Og det er også et eksempel på at man har tenkt at man skal på en eller annen måte ha en sånn sertifisering av for eksempel da taxiplattformselskaper ut fra om de følger, om de er ok mot arbeidsfolka sine, og der det kommet et initiativ også til en global liksom, nettverk av sånne småselskaper, som alle som sier vi er sertifisert på den og den måten, vi følger de kvalitetskravene. Og hvis du kjenner til det i Oslo for eksempel, og reiser til London, så skal du kunne finne igjen, der den appen som har akkurat den samme. Så kan det lokalt drevet og så videre, men at man da har en sånn kvalitetsstempel.
Og det ikke eid av noen, kapitalister i New York?
Nei, det det ikke.
Nei, det jo interessant. Dette blir jo litt sånn, det har vi jo snakket om før, det blir jo nesten en sånn kapitalisme uten kapital. Det jo et mye mindre behov for penger her. Du trenger ikke å eie en fabrikk på en måte for å få ting til å gå rundt. Du trenger bare en app. Så det endrer jo spillebrettet litt.
Ja, og når vi nå ser at plattformøkonomien har jo da ikke spredt seg så mye som man kanskje trodde i Norge, men det ikke noe grunn til å tro at den måten å organisere oppgave på vil forsvinne. Og dette en sånn veldig en konstruktiv måte å tenke at men da kan vi godta det, men samtidig få det inn i litt sånn regulerte former hvor det stilles, hvor det mulig å organisere seg for det første, og hvor det stilles krav til arbeidsbetingelser, og hvor den som jobber selv får en større grad av kontroll over arbeidshverdagen sin og betingelsene sine. Så jeg tenker at det mye muligheter der fremover, for teknologien der. Den kan også brukes positivt på den måten.
Ja, men tusen takk, Hilde. Dette var interessant. Her det jo, som du sier, mange av løsningene her jo ganske tradisjonelle med liksom, fagorganisering og motmakt, men den nye økonomien betyr også at vi må tenke nytt om en del ting.
Ja, og det en stor utfordring, ikke minst for den tradisjonelle fagbevegelsen, å kunne ta tak i noen av disse mulighetene.
Ja, send med den utfordringen videre.
Ja, bare før Hilde løp ut døra her, så kom hun med en liten presisering. Ja,
hun kom til skade for å si at 1% av de i arbeidsfør alder jobbet i plattformøkonomien. Det ikke helt riktig. Det 1% som har utført arbeid i plattformøkonomien. Så det betyr at det 1% som har vært innom og gjort et eller annet oppdrag eller et eller annet sånt.
Leiligheten på Airbnb.
Ja, ikke sant. Sånne ting. Men ikke nødvendigvis har det som sin fremste geskjeft her i livet.
Nei. Så det ikke meningen å overdrive problemet i Norge, men likevel verdt å snakke om. Ja,
rett skal være rett.
Da kjører vi bare på med anbefalingene, før vi sier takk for i dag.
Det gjør vi. Jeg har lyst til å anbefale dette kanskje litt for spesielt interesserte, men jeg synes det et interessant poeng likevel. Det et foredrag av en britisk valgforsker som heter Ben Ansell, som har et foredrag som heter Wealth Inequality in Political Perspective, som ligger på YouTube. Og poenget hans der interessant, selv om man ikke nødvendigvis ser hele foredraget, og det det at boligulikhet forklare en del rundt hvorfor folk stemmer på Brexit, høyrepopulisme, på Trump, ikke sant? Fordi at når det store ulikheter i boligmarkedet, så det noen som ikke har anledning til å flytte rundt, mens noen har anledning til å flytte rundt. Og det betyr at man får en annen form for attachment til det lokale og til kulturelle spørsmål da. Og dette jo en litt ny tilnærming til til dette da. Det vanlige har jo vært å snakke om at vi har en høyre-venstre-akse i politikken, og så har vi en kulturell akse som noe helt annet. Men dette jo en tilnærming som sier at i hvert fall noe av det som tilsynelatende handler om kultur, handler også litt om penger. Så det jo interessant å ta med seg. Vi skal linke den videoen også i den saken her når vi deler på,
det kan være.
På interwebs. Enn du, har du noen anbefaling også?
Ja, det handler litt om penger det også.
Alltid.
Alltid litt om penger. Det har jo vært denne World Economic Forum samlingen i Davos, denne rikmannsgjengen som samles, og i år igjen så de veldig bekymret for både økende ulikhet og klimakrise og det ene med det andre. Uten at noe egentlig ser til å skje da. Det ikke så mye forbedring og skue selv etter utallige Davos-konferanser. Men det jeg skulle anbefale fordi på scenen i Davos så var det en fyr som heter Rutger Bregman, som også har gitt ut, eller boka hans har også gitt ut på Respublika, som heter Utopia for realister.
Du har intervjuet han, har du ikke det?
Jo, han var på et agendamøte, så det kan dere sikkert se på YouTube også. Men dette også et klipp som dere kan finne på hans Facebook-side, hvor han veldig oppgitt over at ingen i Davos snakker om det som på en måte det åpenbare eksempelet. Han sammenligner det med at det var på en konferanse for brandmenn, og ingen snakket om vann, og det nemlig skatt. Alle disse rike menneskene veldig opptatt av å do good, og være filantroper, og samle inn penger, og masse greier, men ingen snakker om skatt. Og det synes jeg var et veldig viktig og riktig påpekning fra Bregman, selv om han sier at han kommer sikkert aldri til å bli invitert tilbake til Davos.
Pay your taxes.
Ja, så det finner du på hans Facebook- og Twitter-konto i hvert fall. Anbefales. Ok. Da snakkes vi neste uke.
Det gjør vi. Ha det godt.